Hello, everyone, and welcome to the session. Joining me today is Catherine Burns. Welcome back, Catherine.
Thank you.
So let's just pick up where we ended off last week, which was a long session tracing the history of apartheid from 1948 all the way up to 1994. Well, actually, up until 1990. So at that point in time, apartheid hadn't ended. And we see that in the 1990s, there was a lot of movement towards a transition towards democracy. And what we're going to focus on for this week is the period, it's a short period in our history of 1990 to 1994, where a lot of happened prior to our current democracy. To start off with, however, I thought it would be really useful to give the students a good indication of what health looked like at the start of 1990s, what people were seeing in terms of mortality and morbidity in the country, and these big disparities as a consequence of apartheid across these four racial categories that the apartheid government instilled. Would you be able to give us a little bit more of a picture of the health landscape at the start of 1990?
Yes, I think that's very, very important for our students to think about, and it links very well to the Van Rensburg reading, but I want to give people a slightly bigger context. And the way that I thought we could climb into this really complex space is for the students to think about three different vantage points. Let's take the vantage point first of health activists, which would include a lot of doctors and nurses, but also public health policymakers, people thinking about law, people thinking about infrastructure changes that were needed. Huge weight on people that there was never going to be an end to this form of state. There was this enormous hope. Terror, fear on many people's parts, especially if they were part of the status quo or had something to protect. But we've read in documents the last few years that even people inside of the National Party cabinet had a kind of feeling of, okay, we're going to be given a chance to change this sort of dreadful impasse that we've arrived at. So the first vantage point is one of fear, tension, but also hope. And if we're inside of the country and you were involved in health in any way, either as a clinician or as a planner, you were thinking to yourself, what are the basic forms of data that we need? And what we've got to head towards. And so the sort of litmus test of infant mortality and morbidity and adult mortality and morbidity, burden of disease, profiles of disease, this data was something everybody turned to. Now, the National Party had, in the final years of apartheid, been trying to hide the fact that health disparities had widened and widened ever further. So, of course, one of the great charges that the international community and the progressive community of people inside of South Africa, like churches, faith groups, and people agitating against apartheid, both from outside and inside, whether you were the WHO, or whether you were academics abroad, or whether you were activists such as people affiliated with the ANC or with other groups. One of the great charges against apartheid is that it had produced a sick society. We've spoken about this before. And the indicators that showed this grossly and overwhelmingly were infant mortality, maternal mortality statistics, and then the particular skewing of the burden of disease in three different axes. On the one hand, rural, urban, absolutely unbelievable rates of disease burden and of mortality in rural areas, which had grown exponentially through the creation of the Bantustan system or the homeland system, which we've already talked about, which had got much worse over the period of the 20 years building up to 1990. Second of all, the greater disparities in urban areas along racial lines than could even have been imagined in the 1940s in the period of Gluckman. So instead of the so-called rising up of South Africa's white middle class having produced knock-on effects and lifted the health conditions of people who were from the majority groups or other minority groups, so-called coloreds and Indians. Instead of that having happened across the board, there was enormous disparity. And then the third, and possibly the most complex, that the rise of private medicine and private healthcare had really created a class wedge, so that for the first time you saw South Africans of Indian descent and some people called colored and some small groups of middle-class African people who had access to private healthcare through their employers. You saw a sudden and massive disparity between that community of people accessing private care and people in the state system. And this was the sort of cesspool that people were looking into, staring into in 1990. And whether people were on the left or on the right of the political spectrum, there wasn't a lot of fighting about the fact that this was grotesque and it needed to be addressed. Now, how was it going to be addressed? Well, that's the kind of debate, Stephen, that people were then going to have to put on the table. What was going to be the methodology? What was going to be the health systems approach? What was going to be what informed the policy-making process about how to move forward?